Before we begin tonight's program, I want to do a call out and a thank you to Don and Brenda Mallett, who are in our audience tonight, for their very generous underwriting of this series and for their support throughout the years of the lecture series. Don and Brenda have made the decision to financially support programs and that they encourage now. Why wait, they ask. And they invite you to do the same, to make a donation to the lecture series or another program that's important to you. And of course, I want to thank all the supporters of this program over the years, in whatever way that was. Used to be bringing cookies or financial donations. Finally, I want to say a deep thanks to the lecture series planning committee who made this evening and this series possible. You will see their names again on the slides at the end of the show. So with that, I want to begin our soulful conversation for the evening, and I will introduce Pastor Todd Smiedendorf. Todd will introduce Michael, and over the course of the next 90 minutes, you will hear from Michael, you will hear a conversation between Michael and Todd, and then there will be time for question and answer. So here we go. I'd like to introduce Pastor Todd Smiedendorf, who is the bridge minister here at University UCC. Todd comes to us tonight from his home in Boulder, Colorado, where I understand it is very smoky with fires nearby and very windy as well. He lives in Boulder, Colorado with his wife, Allison. Todd was ordained in the UCC almost 20 years ago, and he has been with us here at UCC for almost 2 years as this church discerns the call for a new minister. In 2015, Todd attended the border immersion trip to Nogales, Arizona at the Mexico border, co-sponsored by the UCC and the Church World Service. With that, I will turn it over to Todd.
Thank you, Betty. Thank you to the committee, and thank you to all the supporters of the lecture series. Thank you to Michael for saying yes. Let's take a deep breath and offer a prayer in any way that fits for you. I'll offer one and invite you to go along. Take a deep breath and just let it out. Spirit, tonight, may the words spoken and the words heard serve to bring more fully your realm of justice and peace, your beloved community of blessing. May this be so here and now. Amen. Thank you for being here. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Michael Ramos, who came to the Pacific Northwest 37 years ago as a Jesuit volunteer to work with people on the streets at a day drop-in center in Tacoma. He proceeded to work with housed and unhoused Central American refugees in Seattle. He has continued bringing a faith lens to work alongside people and communities experiencing marginalization for most of the last 3 decades. This includes 6 years of ministry with the Latinx community in Oakland, where he was involved in the formation stage of what is called today the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. He currently serves as executive director of the Church Council of Greater Seattle, a position he has held since 2008. In this capacity, he has been engaged in direct service, education, advocacy, and organizing efforts for living wages with people experiencing homelessness and being alongside recent immigrants. Through the Church Council, he has been an active advocate for equitable resourcing across the continuum of care throughout the geography of King County. The Church Council has worked with community-based partners to support local leaders to organize at the intersection of homelessness and the critical lack of low-income housing. He serves on the King County Pandemic Advisory Group, the steering committee of the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, and as board president of Puget Sound SAGE. He has just completed his Doctor of Ministry degree program at Seattle University. Wow, congratulations on that. He is married to Donna with 2 adult daughters. It's my pleasure to welcome tonight Michael Ramos.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Betty. Thank you, Jeff and Rose, and all the team that have put together this wonderful lecture series. I'm grateful and honored to join you on this first evening, and I feel a kinship with University Congregational Church in our continued walk together for God's dream for justice. I'm glad to share with you all tonight. The title for this presentation is "To Cross Borders is to be Human, to Tear Down Border Walls, Divine." Crossing borders is faithful walking in the ecosystem of God's justice. Our ancestors, biblical and familial, showed us the way. When the Church Council embraced the new sanctuary movement in 2007, the words of Rabbi Jonathan Singer of nearby Temple Beth Am rang out. The prophets of old warned us as they echoed the values expressed so clearly in a tradition common to Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Respect the stranger in your midst. There shall be one law for them and for you. For you were once slaves in Egypt, and God freed you with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. The prophets taught us not to remain silent when in our midst we recognize injustice. It is you, Isaiah said, who must break the yoke of oppression and tear down the chains of injustice. Right about that time, a woman from El Salvador with 2 small children came to a Bible study that I was leading in a church, as I held up a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in another, holding faith and the reality of life together. She had no place to stay that night. The church opened its doors and hearts to them. They persevered through the arduous journey, as she had been a victim of a crime, to gain a U visa and status for the family. There were moments of uncertainty, not knowing how things would turn out. Would she be deported? What about the health of her children? She entered the wilderness of liminal existence, and by conviction and by love, she crossed into a future of hope that she would overcome. The U visa was granted, and she opened a catering business, often serving pupusas a few blocks away from University Congregational Church. Walking and crossing borders shows us what it is to be human. It upholds and affirms the fundamental commitment to the preservation of life. It is a reflection of courage to be people on the move, wanting not just to survive, but to thrive, belong, connect, share what one has. Crossing borders is a direct challenge to what the poet Patrick Chamoiseau calls worse than inhumanity is dishumanity, the denial and erasure of humanity. Signs at the southern border demonstrate this crime playing out today against all that is good, all that is decent, dignified, and humanizing. The Mexico-US border today is currently closed for quote-unquote non-essential business, yet thousands continue to assert their right to life. Today, 26,000 people are on the Mexican side, waiting to exercise their human right to ask for asylum. An additional 65,000 people who have already passed the first step of a credible fear interview are being forced to wait until their hearing, perhaps months away and as far away as El Paso, Texas. Today, the most human remains have been found in 2 Arizona counties by the border since 2013, and the year is not over yet. 575 unaccompanied children have been deported after temporary stays in the US without any communication with loved ones, without COVID, yet deported in order to prevent COVID. 300 family members, including 127 children, are being detained in family detention centers, a violation of legal agreements regarding children. There are 5,000 immigration detention positive cases of COVID-19. Spending time with women asylum seekers, whether separated from children or having survived the harrowing journey across borders, has revealed a glimpse of how God walks alongside of suffering people. Catherine Lacuna, the theologian, notes that the very nature of God is best addressed as God with us. God with us. Consistent with women's experience, God's faithfulness is made concrete in daily life. The listener learns in the story of Exodus that God enters into suffering and is felt as breath, ruach, feminine in Hebrew, ushering God's people into movement. Indeed, the story of the Jewish people, rooted in the liberating experience of the Exodus, is a story of people on the move from one home to a new place of settlement. Walter Brueggemann views journey or migration as a metaphor for the people of God seeking to live faithfully in a world where scarcity leads to violence and oppression. The feminist theologian Yvonne Gabarra suggests, when women suffering the evil of dispossession, powerlessness fight for their dignity, they fight also for power over their lives. If and how we join this fight is the mark of faithful accompaniment and solidarity. Asylum seekers were detained at SeaTac in 2018 after being separated from their children, not knowing where they were and when and if they would see them again. Enduring such harrowing experiences near the border in detention, called the freezer or the dog pound in detention, and other forms of dishumanity. I was touched by the assertion of human dignity by these women after being bonded out, shedding prison clothes and choosing apparel at Goodwill, insisting by one woman to another that I must see my fellow inmate to see how she is doing, because she had suffered such trauma in detention that I must see her, and how I was privileged to see them hugging and crying together for what they had suffered and what was to be a new beginning. Seeing the joy of these women walking together in Volunteer Park, free from the shackles of repression. Seeing the photos of asylum seekers being reunited with their children. In addition to this reality today, our immigrant siblings now north of the border face a fourfold crisis, one in which we have a share as well. First, the pandemic. First responders needing to work to live, with PPE often lacking. When having COVID, less resources for health care, increased risk for families. In Washington state, 23.5% of COVID cases are Spanish speaking, while comprising only 6.4% of the population. Second, economic devastation. High unemployment rates, permanent losses of jobs, many not qualifying for the stimulus payment without a Social Security number or the unemployment supplement under the CARES Act if you happen to be undocumented or a member of your household was undocumented. Third, the racial reckoning, the unveiling of our complicity in white supremacy. And fourth, the fomenting of hate and violence, dehumanizing rhetoric, egging on hate groups, attacks on people based on religion, race, immigration status, gender, identity, not to mention the war on the environment and the ongoing threats and carrying on of military war. Internal borders to cross. Patrick Chamoiseau, in the book Migrant Brothers, A Poet's Declaration of Human Dignity, eloquently illuminates the present reality for migrants the world over. He says, everywhere to various degrees, children, women, men who want to move are ground up in lawless spaces in which human beings become strangers to humanity. Borders are sharpened more and more like the blade of a guillotine. Around them, those who come as humans toward other humans, whose only crime is to be human, and call out to their brothers and sisters from the depths of a very human distress, find themselves faced with systems which no longer how to recognize a human being. Yet in the face of dehumanization, Salvadorans, Somalis, Muslims, Sikhs, people of color, those labeled non-human, step across a boundary that is in the end arbitrary. Immigrants and refugees connect worlds. They are prophetic. Chamoiseau goes on to add that the antidote to dishumanity is to perceive the world as a relational whole, a globality, he says. We live in an ecological and human totality where we might construct peace with justice. He says, in the oxygenated luxuriance of encounters, of a mobility in which differences are present, of a solidarity exchange that makes everyone grow, and of a human competence that in all circumstances will retain its aptitude to recognize humanity wherever it might go, wherever it might come from. Such a return to the sacredness of human relations returns us to our true selves. As Dr. James Cone said, what is done to them is done to us. They see light, hope in the midst of suffering, in the prospect of what Letty Russell calls a just hospitality, where the border of otherness is broken down and mutuality and solidarity is born. She says Christian hospitality goes beyond caring for the other to enabling them to care for themselves and others. This sort of hospitality that makes this possible would be one that sees the struggle for justice as part and parcel of welcoming the stranger. Difference is the gift that challenges us to practice such hospitality by resisting oppression and working for full and human life and dignity with those with whom we stand in solidarity. God says in Isaiah 65 that a new heavens and a new earth, a new creation is in gestation. The earth groans for our engagement. Changing the story means confronting the narrative of the U.S. as a place of unbridled welcome and shared prosperity. It means that immigrants and refugees are not the objects of our largesse. We can accept or neglect the invitation to cross over into their lives. They are protagonists in their struggle for life and life in abundance. We may be invited to walk alongside. Immigrant leaders have something to teach us. To do this, we need to demonstrate cultural humility and cross the border with them, to see the world from their eyes, to hear the word of God that is their lives. To walk with means not only to appreciate the racism that underlies the oppression, often gendered oppression, that they experience. It also means to name it, claim our part in it, and lament, repent, discern, and act. In acting consistent with the concomitant commitment with Black Lives Matter, we are also upholding and affirming equity with Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, Native peoples, African and Caribbean folks. In many ways, this is my own journey, with relatives still struggling to rebuild yet again in Puerto Rico. The experience of recent immigrants is marked by suffering. From our comfortable position, it's often hard to see affliction in others. Of course, this has sources in American foreign policy and domestic policy. Yet there is the belief expressed in Spanish, toda tiene su maña. Everything has its trick. Another way of saying that the reign of God emerges by surprise. From a place of seeming powerlessness, a moment began that led to the release by the governor of Washington of $400 million from the state for undocumented relief. It happened in no small part that because people who have spent their lives crossing borders of one kind or another spoke directly to the governor. They shared stories of living and dying with COVID, of working the harvest so the family has food at the table, of loss of work, but with a resolve to make a way out of no way, of it depending on family, friends, and community. Other faithful people, the Church Council of Greater Seattle, and with the support of many, including University Congregational Church and the University District Hub, were inspired to provide direct assistance, rental assistance, food assistance for people undocumented, asylum seekers, people who came together as a solidarity group. Not only did they receive direct assistance, but the connection allowed for the conversion to a capacity to change their own situation, to maintain family despite the obstacles, to cross borders of new relationships. Following the lead of local and state and immigrant communities, for us, solidarity undergirds accompaniment, resistance, hospitality, all actions of crossing borders taking flight. Solidarity includes the hospitality that's given to refugees and immigrants today, accompaniment to hearings and appointments where people do not feel alone, the resistance of crying out to maintain DACA, to allow people to apply for asylum, to stop unjust evictions. The asylees, the DACA recipients, the undocumented people maintain a core spirituality that inspires us. They have what's called a mística, that God delivers, accompanies, sustains, and walks with us. They manifest an entrega, giving themselves over to one another selflessly. They live out of convivencia, that community gathering, usually around food, where you belong, where you are at home, where you have a place and you celebrate in the midst of all the joys and all the sorrows. John Sobrino suggested solidarity is bearing one another's burdens. A community of solidarity invokes critical consciousness and creates alternative experiences of convivencia in search of the common good. It also implies social and structural change that benefits and centers people who long for their own liberation. And we who accompany see our own liberation bound up in theirs. The undocumented relief, our support with the University District Hub and beyond of food, rental assistance, and supporting local community organizations in South King County from an anti-racist lens were acts of solidarity. They were acts that upheld and affirmed that within each of us there is a transformative power that says, "Sí se puede," yes we can, and cries out that even with setbacks, the people will not be denied what is due to them as a matter of justice. Three threads emerge to orient our border crossing. First, the truth will set you free. We share with our immigrant and refugee siblings a common humanity where equity should abound because we are equal in dignity. Second, change begins with ourselves, and it is crucially important. Third, the power of relationships saves everything. The other is our neighbor, our sibling. We are creatures together trying to live in right relationship with the Creator. A Salvadoran leader powerfully said to me, "The greatest hope is this, to have an affirmative legal adjudication, to be able to have tranquility. The tranquility that all human beings, I think, merit, because to migrate is a right for all, not only for those of us who are suffering a situation of war, a cordon of violence in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, that is the Northern Triangle of Central America. Joy is experienced alongside suffering. The two are held together. Continuing to walk, that is, continuing to cross borders in order to survive and thrive, is a cry out on behalf of their and our own humanity, a restoration of dignity, and a challenge for our accompaniment and solidarity. Love overcomes fear, is the path to freedom, and is the active agent in the collective story of liberation. In immigrant and refugee communities, another world is possible. A conclusion I had from interviewing Salvadoran women for my doctoral thesis was that the word that they speak was that the survival journey of struggle and suffering yielded resilient, gracious, communal, life-affirming, wise women bending toward justice. Will we grieve and exult in proximity to one another, such that hope and history might rhyme once more? I conclude with a poem that I wrote July 4th, 2019. It's called A Desalambrar. It roughly translates to tear down the fence. Razor wire coils recoils on rolling dust hills, peering for bad hombres looking to feed their children. Toddlers circle around in soiled diapers, held by teens unknown. Left over from aunts and uncles' pleas for mercy, the proud having sent them away. Fence turns inward on Jose y Maria. Who wants to take care of this baby? Hard ground, mano dura, fluorescent lights that do not shine but burn harsh. Alone to freeze, with mucus on their clothes and dirt on their necks. Clean and sanitary, intones the official. Judge says, let me wash your mouth out with the soap you did not provide. Chorus, perhaps the patrol can spare some wire, 'cause though no toothpaste, they can at least floss. long political expediency of regime of raids, detention, and deportation. Walk on the backs of father and daughter. Highway of misery. Minutemen and vigilante machismo cry round the exhausted, breathless, "We are the patriots." Intrepid reporters photo shame, triumphant on two sides border. Jaded columnists who have witnessed war puzzle. Desert silence for outrage. Water-bearer offers life itself, carried off to jail. Chorus, my tears mingle with the young mother. A desalambrar, tear down the fences. No fence can stop us from the embrace of our queridas. Wire clippers of hope. A heart-sized hole emerges that justice escape. A desalambrar. Take to the streets, now I know who I am. Human creature beating drums, a luchar. Spirit guides hands, tear down the fence, dismantle the ankle monitor of souls, open a river of hands clasped through ugly slats. Es nuestra tierra, de todas y todos. Once awake, we cling to horizon of healing without exclusion. Chorus, dismantle oppression. How long? Not long. For long walk to freedom stretches from sea to shining sea. Without authorization, save the liberty of all tied together. National Day of Sanctuary, where land stolen is respected. Reverenced in return for separated families, for restoration of childhood, for recall of dignity, for their relations, for our humanity. A desalambrar, tear down the fences. Liberation from the cages of despair. Solidarity march for love, by love, of love. Ánimo, adelante. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Taking a deep breath just to take it all in. Yeah. Michael, one of the things that I find informing in a way, forming of faith for me, is to hear the power of story from others around their faith passion. And so I'm curious if you have a sense of where this passion came from for you. I could feel it certainly in your presentation, this passion for justice, compassion around immigration, migration as life. Do you have a sense of how that fire started to burn in you?
Well, in all honesty, it comes from my mother.
Mm-hmm.
My mother's a very devout, faithful person who always fought for the rights of her kids in school, in society, in life. And so this sense that faith and justice are not separate but one kind of has been part of my life. And then coming to the West Coast in many ways allowed me to find myself as a person who was both privileged educationally and part connected with the Latinx community, just as my grandfather from Spain came and worked as a hotel bellhop in downtown Manhattan for 25 cents an hour back in 1922. So it ties both with my family and then seeing in the people, particularly when I first came to Seattle, Salvadorans and Guatemalans seeking asylum and being denied routinely by Judge Nail. Some of you may remember, Judge Nail routinely denied asylum, part of the 98 to 99% of denials across the United States during those times in the early 80s.
Mm.
So it fired me up to find ways to accompany. I've had to learn along the way, and I've run into amazing people both in Oakland and Seattle. It's all been blessing.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I think of my mother also. I grew up in a part of southwestern Michigan that does well with agriculture because of Lake Michigan and just how things roll there with the climate. And a lot of agricultural workers would come in. A lot of those were Hispanic. And my mother would go out and volunteer at basically like a daycare area. And so just by that simple act of taking me along, which in part I'm sure was economic, that's just the way it was, you bring your kids along.
Yeah.
It also got me started with seeing a different life situation than I knew. It was working class, but in a different form and with a different language. And that was really helpful for me. I mention that because I heard this theme of, you called it dishumanity, that seems to be a part of the reality that's happening with the border. And I certainly saw that on my border immersion trip back in 2015 down in Nogales. So many thanks to Randy Mayer, the pastor at Good Shepherd UCC in Sahuarita, just north of Nogales, to Reverend Noel Anderson, who was hired by the UCC to really track this. You maybe know.
I know him, yes.
Oh, what a beautiful man.
Yes.
And so all the people who are doing that work, and the biggest education, I think for me, and it seems like, I guess I want to universalize it, is meeting people in their humanity makes all the difference. It changes the equation. And so that trip for me was circled all the way back to that early childhood experience and just seeing it as an adult and seeing it in a different way, seeing the reality of it, how people are dropped off with nothing when they're deported, for example. I've shared this with our congregation. And hearing and really knowing it in that moment, the Catholic priest, this was a Catholic mission, the Catholic priest coming through to talk to all these people who'd been dropped off with nothing at the Keno Border Initiative, just to tell them, you are not illegal. And to repeat that several times, you are not illegal. He was well aware of this dynamic that you named. There's something dehumanizing about what's happening.
Yeah.
And he was just trying to restore that, just trying to say, hey, don't let that sink in. Hear this other message. Yeah.
Right. And there's a direct connect between the experience at the border and the experience up north, as far as here as Seattle and going north up and Eastern Washington. We're always crossing borders, and we really learn through the asylum seekers experience the sense of the trying to take away people's humanity. And people didn't know if they were going on a plane to Washington State or Washington, D.C. They were just separated from their children, terrified what was to happen. And it took a humongous effort for people to finally get bonded out through the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project largely, and other attorneys. But this sense of reclaiming your dignity, recovering humanity, and the sense that the ground is firm and I can continue to walk even though the next step. So thank you for sharing your experience.
Yeah, I think I'll always remember that from that moment, is that it's very different to, how did you put it? It was a cultural humility that you asked for in your words. And something about cultural humility can happen, not always, but can happen when we get out of the story that we're in and try to get into another story.
Yes.
Really willing to. And that's what the immersion trip did for me. Had me see another story and feel it by crossing over and just seeing it right up front of me. Making it human rather than turning people into cartoon characters in my movie.
Absolutely. Yes.
People are just this or they're just that, or I know all about this group. And yet here we are there in the moment at the border and just hearing story of Jesus, who was deported from Issaquah, stayed in the detention center in Washington, and just hearing that story and realizing human beings with a story. Yeah. All with a story. Yeah.
Absolutely.
One question I wanted to ask of you, Michael, also was, I think I heard the answer, but I'll do a little seminary trick on you and ask you these basic questions. Who is God amidst all this, and what is salvation?
Well, there's a danger in being trained theologically. And the Western mind, we tend to operate from our heads.
Yes.
And the women I have studied, the women and men I have walked with over the last 25 years, say that God walks with them in their hearts.
Yes.
And suffers alongside of them. And they know God in a different way. And I have learned through their ability to experience joy in the midst of sorrow, to be able to celebrate with both joy and sorrow from one breath to the next, is a kind of spirituality, what the word in Spanish is mística, that I wish to embrace, I wish to know more about. So God walks with, suffers with, accompanies, and is there present in the very experience and the uncertainty that people crossing borders, women and men and children, are experiencing. So it has a lot to do with experience. It has a lot to do with movement. It has a lot to do with walking. And it has a lot to do with what I call convivencia.
Yes.
What is called by the women and men that I know, they call it convivencia, that come together where we can let our hair down. We can be ourselves. We feel we belong. We have nothing to prove. We just want to love one another. Yeah. And so that's where God seems to be present. That's been my experience, both for the people having been to El Salvador and knowing many Salvadorans here. And it's the experience of many in the Latinx community that I've come across, recent and not so recent immigrants. And it's one that, of course, crosses over that I see in many different nations, the Somali community, other communities here present in the Seattle area. And for that, it's all gift. So then to know God is to love God, and to love God is to see God in the face of one another. So in any case, that's it springs straight from the people, not from my head.
Yes, from their experience. Yeah, incarnate. Thank you for that term, convivencia. I hadn't heard that since my last church. I had the privilege to serve with Reverend Nancy Rosas, who now serves a church in Buffalo, New York. And wonderful. Yeah, Nancy had that journey herself as a child growing up in El Salvador during its wartime in the 80s and having to flee to Guatemala and eventually came to the United States. Thank you for that. It's a warm reminder of a great ally in that struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. And so there's God with us. I heard that, Emmanuel, and these women shared that with you. What is the presence that's most needed right now? Talking, for example, to, I know not everyone on this call is from University Congregational, but talking to Christian congregations, perhaps those like University Congregational, what is the witness? What is the call of the gospel to these communities? How do you hear that?
Well, there is this movement that I suggested 4 years ago, that there's a movement for such a time as this, that we need to collectively lament, repent, discern, and act.
Yes.
And that's a constant, it's a circle. It incorporates sorrow, but doesn't end there.
Yeah.
And so it's a life affirming circle. And it requires somewhat stepping out of ourselves and our comfort zones, which means speaking truth in uncomfortable places.
Mm.
It means acknowledging our complicity in how we other people in one way or another, and how we need to address our own participation in racist systems and practices, and begin to dismantle what we call generally white supremacy.
Yes.
The domination culture and system, as Walter Wink spoke of, and to work assiduously toward equitable relationships and equitable systems. It's a lifetime work.
Yeah.
And so my experience with church life is that it requires encounters with others than the people I'm most comfortable with, perhaps even on Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm.
And to be able to, as it were, cross borders, to be able to listen to the experience of others and how we act and impact for the good, a more just society, more just and equitable relationships. And so to enter into relationships with, as you mentioned, cultural humility. All of these things are, items for training, reflection, discernment, preparation, welcoming people who are not, usually welcome into our spaces, to be able to have genuine conversation. Seattle, for example, has a long history of underlying racism within our communities,
Mm-hmm.
but we're very reticent to talk about it. We're very reticent to say that we, a progressive community, could be complicit in racism.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if anything, the summer has taught us is, say, we can't continue to dwell in the mythology that it's not about us. It's about all of us. It's about all of us, and that this spirituality that says that transformation is good and necessary and just, and that there are myriad ways in which that may happen. But the Spirit's calling us to change.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I loved your quoting of Letty Russell. You call that a just hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, part of the shocking learning for me when I went to the Nogales border were the stories that illustrated the incredible militarization of the border.
Mm-hmm.
As a citizen living not near the border generally, it was just caught me off guard. I was in some ways just unaware totally. And when I heard a story of someone's parents who had gone across the border in the 60s, the simplicity of it was amazing. It was going to the border, it was filling out some paperwork, and I think maybe there was a $25 fee or something like that. And that was the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And they drove into the United States, and he grew up here in Arizona.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it was, there was a civil penalty, maybe that's the right category. The penalty for being in the nation without proper documentation or without the proper authorization was a fine of some sort. And it's like getting a heavy traffic ticket kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that now the system has been built such that it is the kind of crime that would prejudice anyone's future chance of being here or being a full citizen. So
Yes.
the militarization and the criminalization have gone hand in hand. And it was just a great disappointment to me as a citizen to see this. It struck me as fear and paranoia being codified.
Right. Thank you for pointing that out. It exists today, and it's part of a fabric where violence and perpetuation of violence is tolerated as policy and practice.
Yeah, as policy and practice. That's a beautiful way to say it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's nothing like being able to actually get into that other story. So the immersion trip was 100 times better than reading a great article. Yeah, being there, feeling the fence, feeling the tension, just going through it all and getting educated while being there was something.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thanks to all those people doing that great ministry. So
thank you.
You and many others.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps it's time for a break, and we'll come back with Q&A. You can just type those into the box, and we will do our best to get to as many as we can. So maybe now's a good time for a break, and we'll be back shortly.
Hi, everybody. So welcome back. We're going to welcome Todd and Michael back to the screen here. And we're going to spend about 15 minutes or so in questions. And I believe there are some queued up. Todd, can you see those questions queued up?
I can. Michael,
right,
are you
ready? I'm
ready?
going to disappear and leave these to you guys.
Okay. We've got several questions. Let's start with a simple one, simpler. They could all go on. Michael, how does an empathetic, this is from Rosemary, thank you. How does an empathetic, loving person like you keep from burning out?
Well, you got to love what you're doing. That matters. And the wonderful opportunity that we have had to, in essence, meet new people every day through accompaniment in hospitality and short-term housing, through accompaniment in the accompaniment to hearings program, in ways of demonstrating solidarity through advocacy, through walks, marches. The state organization, the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, is probably the most uniting immigrant-led organization that's an umbrella that has been created over the last 25 years. That involves hundreds of organizations underneath, and it's recent immigrant-led. And so the sense of we're in this together, sense that there is movement, there's movement forward, and that maybe the spirit with which I've been brought up, Daniel Berrigan, Dorothy Day, people from New York City, Daniel Berrigan I knew when I was in college, and this sense of that resistance comes like the air with being faithful. And so, and that there's joy in the community that's formed through communities of resistance. How do you, as communities, come, as Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, says, to restoration and wholeness more readily? And so it's always a challenge to try to stay the course when so many adverse things happen.
Yeah.
I would say that through my faith, I remain a hopeful person. And we have had, in spite of many setbacks, many things go forward. And I was fortunate in California. It was discussed on the radio today, Proposition 187, that was an anti-immigrant initiative that passed in California, denying benefits to people perceived to be undocumented, including medical care, education, including healthcare. It was ruled unconstitutional, and many laws that were passed afterwards, but that were anti-immigrant. What happened? Many people became citizens, and those who were citizens registered to vote, and they turned over counties and cities in the whole state of California, such that many of the immigrant rights provisions are the strongest, best, and most vibrant states. So sometimes the arc of justice takes a while to bend.
Yeah.
Bend.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question here from Carol and Ed. I'm both hopeful and fearful with regard to the election. I believe that Biden will be our next president, which brings me hope. At the same time, I am fearful that many think a change of president will solve all that we face. Assuming Biden does win, what do you see as the most important areas for focus of efforts to bring immigration justice forward?
Well, the basic return to human rights would be a start. Is that people can apply for asylum, that people can present themselves at the border, that an asylum case can be heard, and that people who have a well-founded fear are granted asylum, and that those who are fleeing the incredible violence in certain countries have the temporary protected status to be able to stay here, and then find a solution that involves the recognition of the contributions of countless undocumented people in the United States toward our economy. In many ways, the backbone of agriculture, in many ways, central in many industries such as construction, and yet unrecognized by the legal status that really should be granted, recognizing their humanity. So these are things so we have to recall that we knew, many of us knew that bit by bit, like a drip falling from a faucet, that anti-immigrant policies and practices would be put into place one step at a time throughout the 4 years. And that has been the case. And so how do you help stop the bleeding, do no more harm, and then you start to create just policies that recognize people and allow them an ability to survive and thrive and support their families, which is what we want, which is what all of us want in the United States. That will take some time. And of course, many of these policies, detention, deportation, raids, long preceded the Trump administration. And it transcends, in some ways, political practices. And so we have to be clear-headed, but there may be more space, psychological space, to be able to speak up, for immigrants to give voice to what their hopes and concerns are, and to be able to translate that into just policies.
Mm-hmm.
Hope there, but we have to remain vigilant.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another one from Sharon and David. They want you to talk about some of the support activities of the Church Council of Greater Seattle. This person was very touched to participate in walking to SeaTac Ice with a lot of people supporting Jose as he turned himself in. What other kinds of activities of support happening through the council?
Well, we've been involved in supporting 3 sanctuary situations in the Puget Sound area, as many know. And right now we have, through our wonderful staff person, Kimberly Dominguez Barranco, and Josh Rubenstein, we have an accompaniment program for people who have to attend state court hearings, for other hearings, and there's a volunteer training for that. And so for all those forms of accompaniment, there are ways to sign up for that and to be trained, and that puts you in a community of people, constant refreshers, interact with folks.
Yeah.
You know, it is my guess that there will be some kind of need for public witness, public vigil, public presence, as elections are decided, as court decisions take place, as policies either get thwarted in the courts, or they get put into place to make it more onerous on people. So I would say to consider ways to both encounter immigrant communities, to listen as locally as you can, and to be able to, they may be able to lend a hand in their coming weeks to educate people that there's $400 million available over the next few weeks to be distributed to undocumented households throughout the state of Washington. We can all participate in getting the word out on that. And then in some cases through the church council or accompanying program, to begin to build relationships with people. So my guess is it is staying in touch. I would also say that every denomination, many churches have the equivalent of people who have been to the border or proximate to the border, or, you know, engaged with groups like Church World Service. And so there's plenty of both advocacy opportunities and holding visits from people who have more recently been to the border, who can speak to the reality there, because there hasn't been a lot of discussion around the crisis just beyond the border right now, and what a travesty of injustice is going on there. But we can do more to lift that up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, just a reminder that my trip to the border was 2015, and there was a different administration in charge, and it was still sobering, for sure, to say the least. One last one, a big question. I think you'll have to condense it to the essence of what you think you might be able to say that's important here. But from Royce, dehumanizing the enemy has been a universal practice in wartime, and there have always been citizens who were sympathetic to new immigrants and those who regarded them as enemy. Can you comment on how, through history and now, powerful people have profited from fanning flames of fear, making enemies of refugees?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of good books out there. And so,
great.
So I guess the way I'd approach that question partly is how my own thinking and experience has evolved over the years, is that I'll confess to my friends, who are all of you, is that I used to not necessarily address in every talk on immigration I gave the underlying reality of racism that undergirds the policies and practices that dehumanize, that are immigrant, that try to erase the existence of immigrants within our communities. But I no longer allow that. So the history of racism, racist ideas, and from the beginning, Ibram Kendi is a must-read book, and the pervasive history of racist ideas, not that there was one period, and then racism reared its ugly head again in this way, and then it stopped for a while. No, that's not how it works. So the history. Erica Lee has written a book that goes very well with that. And I'm trying to think of it. I think it's called America for Americans, The History of Xenophobia, the Fear of the Foreigner.
Yeah.
And again, she traces the fact that the animus toward fear and hatred of foreigners is not something that's episodic, that suddenly comes up for a few years and then drops off the map, but it's actually woven into the fabric of society. So racism and xenophobia go together, xenophobia being a form of racism.
Yeah.
Those things are real. At a deeper level, this sense of the need to create enemies, to create others, of people we fear, because we realize that something in our world is changing. The demography of the country is changing. Our sense of our place in society is changing. Our understanding of ourselves and in the challenge, the economic challenge or health challenge or other challenges that we face. And so the tendency to project out our fears on others and label and categorize and to exclude is something that has been part of human reality, and it's part of our nation's history. And unfortunately, those fans have been flamed immensely in recent years.
Yes.
So we have to find ways to counter that. There's a whole history of that. And the reason why I said 4 years ago, when we gathered religious leaders, 100 religious leaders at the church council, and created a network called For Such a Time as This, we said we need to create a new narrative, a new story that is inclusive, a new story that is on equity, a new story that is built on justice. And it's taken many different forms. People have provided all sorts of different kinds of leadership within the community. It's owned by no one, but it is something that a commitment and practice in our local congregations, in our local communities. So this sense of whenever we overcome fear through love, we are building the seeds of a new society. So we all have
Indeed. Thank you. I have another one from Sharon and David. A boy named Pedro stayed in our congregation while his asylum application went through the court. The decision was that he would not be in danger at home and he must return. Instead, he stayed in the US, undocumented. Should he have accepted the denial of his claim?
So what country is Pedro from?
It doesn't say here in the question.
So to use the country of El Salvador and probably Honduras and in many cases Guatemala today, deportation can mean death. This is not the levels of violence, the level of impunity in some of the countries, and the danger that people being sent back face leave one very little choice. If they have options to survive in this country, they will exercise them.
Yeah.
Basic right to life.
Yeah. This person happened to be from Honduras, I understand.
Honduras. Well,
Yeah.
well, the dangers exist. So if it's not that you can go back home, quote unquote, and resume your normal life. It means you may be subject to threats, extortion, violence, and you may lose your life. So it is not, it's a choice that no one wants to face. But if you're a young person right now coming from the northern triangle of El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras, you don't want to go. You don't want to say you've come for a reason. People migrate not because they want to, but because they have to.
Right.
And so people will avoid at all costs going back when the risk to their lives is severe.
Yeah. Reminds me of the poem by Warsan Shire. You know, people essentially are being refugees because home is the mouth of a shark.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful, beautiful long poem she's written. Michael, it's been great to have you. It's for me, it's been a touching and a sobering reminder in a way, but also that call. I love the reminder about the cycle that starts with lamentation but doesn't stay there. And you tying things in with all this joy, all this sorrow theme, and hearing the stories of experience of these Salvadoran women and them sort of sharing their spirit walk on this journey. Those are the things I'm taking away. Thank you.
It's a joy to be with you all, and it's a joy to continue this journey of peace and justice in a spirit of love with each of you and all of you.
Amen.
Michael, I want to add my thanks, deep thanks to you for joining us on this conversation tonight. I wanted to also say, I don't know if you mentioned this, but in the chat line also, there's a lot of interest in your prayer or your poem. And I wonder if we can get a copy of your poem to share with folks in some way.
Sure.
I think we'd all love to have a chance to read that again. I am moved by many things you said. A couple of the things that stick with me are that joy and sorrow, we move from joy to sorrow with each breath, which is so true. And another thing is the transformation really comes within ourselves. We can, hope the world changes because we have a new president or this or that. But the world will change when we are transformed and we are changed. And we do that through walking. I love the idea of walking and with using our hands. We are God's hands and feet. And so I leave tonight thinking about how I can transform myself through the kind of work that you have committed your life to. So I want to thank you for that. We talked about, and Todd, of course, thank you for joining us tonight as well. It is always a pleasure to have your warm compassion fill the room, and it always does. We talked a little bit about books. I want to mention just two other opportunities that we have at the church coming up. One of them is you are joining us again, Michael, for our men's fellowship on November 10th in the evening. And so folks can kind of on the church website found more opportunity to continue this conversation with you that evening. So more information on the website about that. We also, as a church, we are a committed anti-racist church. And so we are doing a number of things in that direction. One of them this fall is to all read the same book. And the book that we are reading this fall is from our local author, Ijoma Olua. So you want to talk about race. And so, anybody who wants to read that book, along with many of us, can either join a conversation, a discussion group about that, or simply read the book and get a lot out of it, I'm sure. So, and of course, we invite everybody in the audience here to join us on Sunday mornings for 10 o'clock worship. But with that, I just want to deeply thank Michael for joining us tonight, and Todd as well. I want to remind everybody to come back next week
And we're going to have another conversation with John Tatmanil, along with Pastor Catherine Foote. So we are excited about this series and look forward. So thank you all. Thank you, audience, for joining us tonight. It's been great to have you back.